Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show one of my favorite Bitcoin educators out there, Anita Posch. Anita was one of the big reasons why I got into Bitcoin in the first place, and I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Anita is, for many of you that know, a Bitcoin educator. She runs a nonprofit called Bitcoin for Fairness, another education initiative called Crack the Orange, and just does so much in the space for Bitcoin education and focusing on Bitcoin education throughout Africa and the global South. So in this conversation, we talk about her work in Africa. We talk about different monetary issues in places like Zimbabwe and what using Bitcoin actually looks like in these areas and why it's so important in the face of totalitarian regimes, and a lot of conversations that we try to put forward in this podcast to make sure that folks know what Bitcoin is, why it's so important, and how folks are using it on the ground. And the role of Bitcoin education is absolutely key. And not only education of just a quick touch point, but as we talk about ongoing education and locals being taught so that they can continue teaching in their own context and different use cases for Bitcoin. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to thank Anita for being so gracious and coming on the show. And so be sure to check out all of Anita's resources as well, which you can find in the show notes. And we discuss in the show her nonprofit, how to donate if you're interested, and how to support Anita's work and the awesome stuff that she's doing out there. So thank you, Anita. And as always, if you have any questions or comments about the show, please feel free to email me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. And we will see you again next week. Hi, Anita, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Trey. Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to be on the Progressive podcast. Progressive Bitcoiner podcast, right?
The Progressive Bitcoiner. And that's another point. I can't remember if it was a tweet a while ago, you and several others, and this is just to show Bitcoin's global impact here. The word progressive is such a US-focused word, which I've known for a while. And, you know, we've been intentional about using it because it does mean something very specifically in the US. And it's also a word I like using to think about Bitcoin, because what is more progressive than Bitcoin in terms of like what we're actually doing? Some people it's a trigger word, others it's not. But for our target audience, it really means something, and there are different values ascribed to it. But that's one thing for folks in the US to listen to, that are listening to this. It's an interesting point, is like progressive. A lot of people around the world, and I think you yourself were like, what is that in reference to? You know, what does that mean? It's such a US context thing. Yeah.
We don't use it at all. So it's not a word that we learn in school or so. As a political movement in the US, I heard it. It's for me also. I only heard it in the context of Bitcoin, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I'm super excited to have you on the show. And for those listening, most people listening right now will know who you are. But if you want to give a quick blurb about who you are, you know, what you've been doing in the space, just before we kick things off.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Anita Posch, and I'm basically a Bitcoin educator. I came into the Bitcoin space in early 2017 when I realized the potential of Bitcoin as a tool for social empowerment. And I thought, on the one hand, I had a 20-year span career in web design and online marketing and things like that. And I got bored of that, and I was looking for something new. And then I found Bitcoin. And it sounds cheesy in a way, but yes, it changed my life. And I decided I want to become a Bitcoin educator because I thought, that's a tool set I already have, and I only needed a little bit of much Bitcoin education to be able to educate others on that topic. And since the social empowerment and humanity and human rights perspective is the one that I early on wanted to focus on, I started to work in that direction. And 1.5 years ago, I think I founded a nonprofit initiative called Bitcoin for Fairness. And the goal of Bitcoin for Fairness is to share Bitcoin education on the ground for the people who need it the most. And most of these people live in the global South, in authoritarian countries. And that's what I do at the moment, and put all my energy behind sharing Bitcoin education with the world. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, and we'll make sure for folks listening to put, we'll put all of the resources in the show notes for you guys to follow up, newsletters, all of your online resources. I'm curious for you, what from a personal end, because everyone has their focus, I think, once they get into Bitcoin. But what for you from like a personal end, whether where you were living at the time about Bitcoin drew you to Bitcoin, and then I think it probably unlocked, there's so many other things with it here, in terms of
Yeah.
education and human rights. But what for you pulled you in initially about Bitcoin?
Initially, the fact that it can't be controlled by anyone, so it's controlled by the community, basically, that there is no leader in Bitcoin, and that it's a tool that can be used as a, I don't like to say it, but it's just a word that comes to my mind, as a weapon against dictatorships and authoritarian leaders. And why do I not like the weapon? Because I think Bitcoin is basically a defense tool. So you can protect your earnings, your savings, your money from overstepping dictators and political parties or whatever. And then and personally, the story behind it is that first I was very well informed, or let's say my grandparents spoke a lot about the Second World War with me, and how it for them was when the Nazis came to Austria, and how they basically lost their Jewish friends and all these kinds of things. And at the same time, I realized very late actually that I'm interested in women and not in men, and realized that actually the government, the legal system, doesn't give me the same rights as everyone else. And I, of course, didn't understand why. And it's also the nation state who had these laws. And so I, of course, also questioned these absolute rules, like the legislation that the majority of a country can put on people who are not the majority. And when I realized that Bitcoin is a tool that enables me and my sisters and brothers in all other countries who have it even worse now than I had it back then, it's a tool for them to regain their power, their freedom, to pay for their protest, to get people out of jail. Yeah, I know lesbians in Zambia who were put into jail because they are just lesbians and they had a rainbow flag when they were out on the street, and that's their whole crime. And if they have a bank account, it's immediately frozen. They can't, they don't have access to their money anymore. And when I realized that, that's also for me the reason why I say, if Bitcoin works in these circumstances, if you have countries which are dictatorships, which work with power and basically pressure and crime against humanity in a way, against their own people, then Bitcoin is the only tool that gives you financial sovereignty and freedom. And when I realized that, I knew that's something I want to do. I want to give something back to the community, to the world, and it fits me, I mean, my role and what I know, what my education and what I learned in the last all my life, it basically, some people say it's my ikigai. Yeah. So everything comes together, and it's also the topic that it gives me so much to work in that space, because I really see progress. I really see empowerment, and I can help with that. I mean, with sharing my knowledge, I really can help people. And I don't mean that in a missionary way or something. Yeah. I don't need that. It's not like it's the only reason why I live. Yeah, no, it's not. Right. But it's a good feeling to be had. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so many different things I want to talk to you about. But I think, also it came to mind as like your skill set. I think you're one of the best educators in the space, and I love talking to people that, you seem to have like a laser focused mission and focus on what's most important in the space. And you've been a role model for me, because I think one of the toughest things for me getting into the space, and I say tough from this privileged position in the West, in the US, but in terms of the community, right? So I came from the left, and kind of getting into Bitcoin education and resources, it was tough for me to find something that I could resonate with, coming from that political persuasion and identity. And all the friends I have from all different stripes and that are kind of turned off by some things in Bitcoin. And Jason Meyer talks a lot about this in his book as well. He wanted to present resources in a language people could understand. And for you, I know we probably share some of those things, but you are so focused on this mission of who is Bitcoin really for? Like, Bitcoin is for everyone, Bitcoin is for anyone, but yes, who is really going to use it day in and day out and has the best use case, and focusing on that rather than focusing on some of these other issues that, to be quite honestly, I can get sucked into and kind of get consumed by, rather than being like, wait, what are we doing here? Like, this is for toppling dictatorships. This is for like human money, promoting human freedom. So I want to commend you for that as well. Those things are important, yes, but just you were laser focused on that mission, and I think everyone sees it, and it's really commendable, and a good model for me as well. I think exploring the space.
Thank you very much, Trey. That's really great to hear, and I appreciate it a lot. But I'm also standing on the shoulder of other giants, and one of that is Andreas Antonopoulos.
Yeah, I figured you'd mention him. Yeah.
I mean, he is basically most of the things I know, and why I do these things, and why I was so glad to see him also. He was the only one, I think, who always stood there for the rights of gay people and transgender people and other minorities as well, of course, but that's my personal thing, Yeah. And so I learned everything actually from him, almost everything. Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, I'm going to turn to a quote here on my other screen for those watching. I think this might be from your website, but it's kind of, I think, at the core of what you focus on too. And so you had said, while mainstream media and economic pundits, and I'm saying this specifically because our audience is global, but I think our target audience too is especially folks in the US, Canada, Great Britain, Europe, who are in a privileged position that maybe they see the word progressive and Bitcoin together, progressive Bitcoin, and they're like, that's interesting. That's not what I've seen before, right? And they might have inclinations to dismiss it or not find it valuable from their vantage point because they don't need it. So I think this addresses this. So you say, while mainstream media and economic pundits in the Western world think it's just a tool for speculation, my goal is to spread the word about Bitcoin as an enabler of financial fairness and social change. What goes unmentioned are the positive real-world implications that a truly permissionless, uncensorable, neutral digital asset with a fixed supply offers. And this might be directly from your book, Learn Bitcoin, which we'll also reference. But can you expand on that a little bit more? Right. So you're obviously from Europe, do a lot of work in Africa. So you see both sides of this, having conversations or seeing in the news folks dismissing Bitcoin or literally labeling it as like an enemy factor. Meanwhile, you're seeing real world implications. So what is that for you to wrestle with both of those things?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I went to the Global South and I focus my work on that problems, because I think it's like the ultimate moment for Bitcoin is when it really can't be censored, when it really serves the needs of those who are oppressed and unfree. Yeah, and the proof of Bitcoin will come in that sense that we will see over the years that it's really the only tool that can't be censored or overtaken by authoritarians, and it can also basically topple autocrats and dictators, yeah, and I think that's not only for me a bigger goal than to let's say be in a Western country with a very high level of living standard, which is great, yeah, and just to make more out of more you already have, So for me, the goal that's more interesting to me is to help those who need it first and who need it more. Not to say that others don't need it as well. And I also have the feeling that the ears and the interest is more open in these countries where you need it more. And like I always say, if Bitcoin works in Zimbabwe, it works everywhere. And that out of several reasons. First, you have this infrastructure problems. You have only like a few hours of electricity a day, if you have electricity at all. The internet is slow. The banks are not working. You have hyperinflation. And on top of that, you have a corrupt kleptocracy that suppresses people and puts them in jail, and also arrests them and questions them about where they got that Bitcoin money from. And if people there still can use Bitcoin for their own freedom and their own well-being, and their government can't take it away, that will be the proof, or that is the proof for me, that it will work everywhere. A lot of people always tell me, but these are just edge cases, those human rights activists who use it and things like that. Yes, but they prove the point. And that's why it's much more, what's the right word for it? It's better, it gives me more, because I have the feeling I can help more people in a way with that knowledge there. They suffer more than people do here. And in a way, I do the things I do because out of that reason. And also it annoys me when I see these media articles where people say, Bitcoin is only speculation and it's only for those people who want to make money fast and we don't need it. It needs a lot of electricity. It's hard to work in a positive way in a surrounding like that, at least for me. So I rather go there where people are interested in it than preaching to the people who don't want to hear it.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. I think I share similar things, and you had mentioned missionary work, so I think I've mentioned it here and to others in the past, right? So my past is in a conservative religious background. That's where I grew up and came from. So also coming into Bitcoin, I'm not much of a Bitcoin evangelist in terms of in that way, or saying grand gestures about Bitcoin that you're like, what does that actually mean? Or like, just for normal people to access and understand. It's like, let's see the proof in the pudding. Let's see what's actually happening. And for folks who say it's edge cases, it's interesting. It's only 14 years old. So of course, if we're 50, 60 years down, imagine the growth of that. And I think for me, I see Bitcoin as a tool. Bitcoin is not the end. The end isn't to have a citadel and rack up as much Bitcoin as possible and just talk about how amazing Bitcoin is. The end goal is more freedom. The end goal is less totalitarian rule. The end goal is more savings for your family, whatever the case may be. That I think applies everywhere, but especially in the context you're mentioning. So for me, the first step and what I like to talk about is like, what are the problems here? So that people could even see what is the point of something like Bitcoin, right? And so when you mentioned Zimbabwe, for instance, we can focus on Zimbabwe. I know you focused on a few different places that you're more than welcome to mention as well. What are some of the problems that are there for an average citizen in terms of monetary policy, and why we're even talking about Bitcoin in the first place?
Yeah, Zimbabwe is, I think, next to Venezuela, one of the countries who are always the leaders in inflation. They have like 500% inflation at the moment. And people in Zimbabwe have experienced in the last 20 years 2 times hyperinflation and a change in their currency, where at the same time, people who had a US dollar account in Zimbabwe on a Zimbabwean bank from one day to the other in 2019, for instance, only 4 years ago, the government and the central bank decided to issue a new currency, the Zimbabwean dollar, and said, you have a US dollar bank account and tomorrow it is a Zimbabwean dollar bank account, but don't be afraid. The exchange value will stay 1-to-1. In early 2020, when I came the first time, the exchange was 1-to-30. And this year, when I came last year in September, I think it was 1 to 200, and now it is 1 to 6,000. So for $1, 6,000 Zimbabwean dollar. And that's the reason why people speak about Bitcoin as an alternative, especially in countries like that. Yes, Bitcoin is volatile, but there is no inflation, no monetary inflation possible. And monetary inflation is a tool which all over the world, but especially in these countries, is used to steal from the people. So the practice is really here to totally control how many US dollars are on the market. Each week, the Zimbabwean Central Bank, Reserve Bank, is holding an auction where they decide on the exchange rate to the US dollar. So no free market anywhere. And you basically have the official bank rate and you have the street market rate, always called black market rate, to make it sound as if it's something bad. But in truth, it's the real value of the money. And just as an example, the exchange, like the foreign currency exchange, like how you can send money out of Zimbabwe and how you can get it back, is totally controlled also by the central bank. If you're, for instance, a business in Zimbabwe and you want to buy goods from South Africa that you need for production or whatever, you have to ask the central bank for US dollars. And then in the auction, it's decided on if you get the US dollars or if you get that exchange done or not. And if you do, then it's not the case that the central bank gives you the US dollar onto your account and you pay your supplier. No, it's the central bank who pays for you. So everything is totally controlled. And the daily problems are that way that the first thing people ask in the morning when they go into a shop or speak with someone else, it's maybe the weather or it's what's the rate today. And if you're in the shop, you have to say what's the rate today because the prices have gone up again.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, a problem. I mean, if the bread you buy costs, like, say, 1 Zimbabwe dollar in 2019, and in 2023 it costs 6,000 Zimbabwe dollar. But you, of course, don't earn more in Zimbabwe dollar. And that's a problem. I don't know how people survive there, I have to say. And another very, maybe even, how you say, not devilish, a devil thing to do or so, like a real bad thing, what the government does is they are printing the Zimbabwe dollar and it's still legal tender. So, for instance, school fees have to be paid in Zimbabwe dollar. That means that the people need Zimbabwe dollar. The government prints those Zimbabwe dollar and then sends runners. They pay people to go to the countryside, to the small villages, and then they get their US dollars for the Zimbabwe dollar because the people need the Zimbabwe dollar to pay for the school fees. So they basically steal their US dollars really in a very mean way. So they know what they do. And people are helpless. What do you want to do? I mean, you need Zimbabwe dollar, you give them your hard-earned US dollar. Or another example, which I found also very interesting, I've never seen that before. We were in Masvingo, in another bigger town of Zimbabwe, and we went to the supermarket. And there was a long line of people outside waiting. And I was saying to my friend, what are these people doing here? Because they said to us, they had their bank card in their hands and said, take mine, take mine. What? And what they do is they give complete strangers, they trust complete strangers, they give them the bank card, and then we should buy our goods with their Zimbabwe dollar. And then outside, we give them the money in US dollar. So that's the way for them to exchange from Zimbabwe dollar to US dollar. So, that shows how problematic the situation is for people,
Yeah, and I think, so many people, especially in the US or the West, just don't even have a basic understanding to start there, right? So I think regardless of what people might think about Bitcoin, the first thing you need to realize is like there is a problem. Like there's a problem, and Alex Gladstein, we'll be talking with him probably a few episodes after this one. as well as his books and resources and so many others are talking about IMF loans, these predatory loans to these countries and these, these regimes. However, and you have a great chart that I'll make sure to get out to people as well about different levels of democracy and, full democracies versus full authoritarian and everything in between. Either way, these countries like to hoard US dollars. They like to hoard gold, the things that they know are valuable, right? And literally steal from their citizens. And Farida Nabarema, who her episode will be out by the time this one comes out, she was saying the same thing in Togo, right? And I want people to understand, like, Africa is not one state, it's not one place, but there are several nations that do similar things in the African continent, and that's one of them. Like, literally stealing from people in that way, whether it's through money printing or literally exchanging because people have no other choice. So that is the problem we're going into. So for those that dismiss Bitcoin outright, what is your solution then? What is the other alternative right now? And I will mention, because some folks have said this to me, and I know Alex and so many others have mentioned, for your experience in Zimbabwe, did you or how did you see the existence of stable coins and things like that? Because there are some practical realities of, I think in some environments, and when people are talking about 200+% inflation, 2000%, whatever it is, a drop above 20% or 50% in Bitcoin, they're like, that's nothing. That's fool's play. We can wait another 5 months for that to come back up, or whatever the case may be. So even that is kind of like, you can pick that apart. But I don't know if I focus too much in talking with people about stablecoin usage in Zimbabwe potentially, but I'm curious just your experience in seeing that play out as well.
Yeah, so to be honest, I myself, I'm not using USDT, so I don't really have a big eye on that. But of course, I hear people doing it and talking about it. I was talking with two people who are Bitcoin traders in Zimbabwe. Both have peer-to-peer exchanged about $200 to $300 a year from US dollar to crypto. And I say crypto because they also say crypto. And one of these guys told me, yes, there are about 20% of people who hold Bitcoin for the long run. They want Bitcoin from me, but 80% want the positive, the advantages of crypto, but they don't want to hold Bitcoin because of the volatility. And that's interesting, because as you said, I mean, if I'm in a country with 900% inflation, then the ups and downs of Bitcoin are nothing. Right. But I think these people are people who are using cryptocurrency for short term. Yeah, like they need it now. In that case, they use it because they need to send it in and out. So they use it on a daily basis, and they don't have the money to put it there and say, okay, I don't take it out for 5 years. Which is actually what you should do with Bitcoin, 3 to 5 years. Right. So they need it immediately. And I always say yes, but I mean, USDT is not censorship resistant. It's a centralized company. It can go down anytime. But that's... people then say, yeah, but I've used it the last year, so, and never happened. You don't know, but that's not the way how you can tell people. You can't tell people what to do. They need to experience it themselves. And I think over the long run, they will also see the difference between USDT and Bitcoin. And I mean, USDT is like USD, but it also has inflation. So for me, it's not a tool to save. It's much too risky for me personally. And I try to explain these kinds of things. But of course, people are doing what serves them best, of course. And so I only because we said this missionary thing before, if people ask me about it, of course, I explain it to them, but I'm not going there and saying you shouldn't use stable coins or things like that. Yeah, they use what they need, and that's okay. So.
Yeah, and that's the tricky part is I'm kind of in the middle of understanding and seeing, and so many others have talked about it so much because there are some in the Bitcoin community that are like, absolutely don't touch it. You're stupid if you use it, right? And it's like, okay, well, you're saying that from a place where you have a full bank account, a stable bank account, FDIC insurance, all of this different stuff, right? But at the same time, I say similar to what my true thoughts on it at some point it could be depegged. At some point it can be censored. At some point it can collapse overnight. With Bitcoin, that is near zero at this point in terms of the global layer of this, where you're right, a company manages and runs USDC, Tether, any other stable coins that are going to come out, at some point it could collapse. And even though you want to use it within the next 6 hours, what if it's within that next 6 hours? So it is challenging. It's a risk, and Bitcoin is less risky in that regard.
Yes, sorry. What I wanted to say was, I also draw a line because people told me, wouldn't it be a good idea to teach people about USDT, how it works and things like that, and how to use it? And I say, no, I'm a Bitcoin educator. I'm not a USDT educator. If someone is asking me, how could I use USDT and exchange it to Bitcoin? Or, how does it relate to Bitcoin or things like that? Of course, I will explain and I will help people. But some people think or say we should start where people are and first show them USDT. And I say, no, why should I? I want to bring Bitcoin education to the people, and because they will use USDT anyways.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I won't have, this for people listening isn't going to be a Tether or stable coin episode.
No.
But it's just curious because people do bring this up and say this, right? And so just kind of thinking of how that'll come in. But in terms of education, getting back to that, so obviously coming from the West, there's Bitcoin education in Africa versus Bitcoin education in the West or in Europe in your context, because there are differences between Europe and US with education and Canada and all of this sort of stuff, which I'll get to. But have you tried to do any education in Europe versus Africa? What has that been like? Obviously, there's some stark differences I can think of immediately, but what has that been like for you? Just the balance there. I know initially you had said, listen, and I'm kind of in that same boat. It's almost Satoshi's quote of like, if you don't understand, I don't have time to tell you. And it's not that quote is actually very frustrating to me, but there are some that are very closed off in the West to it, even though they can kind of understand what I'm starting to say, but they will not listen. In that regard, I'm like, okay, I'm going to pivot to elevating stories of what you're doing, elevating stories in El Salvador, elevating these other stories, because I think that will benefit the Bitcoin community greater. And then eventually those people will come back and they'll say, okay, there was something going on there. This is cool. So for you, how do you see that difference? Do you engage in education in the West, or is your focus mainly just Africa still?
I did. So when I started out, I did seminars and workshops in Austria in German about Bitcoin. But then my focus, became on this tool for human rights and that it serves more people at the moment in the global South than here. Or here they don't really need it because the suffering is not that big. Yeah, we still have a very high living standard, and also I would say quite good democratic systems, although they are deteriorating a little bit also. But so the differences in education, I would say. First, you have much more material in English and in German. You have almost no material in native African languages. The education, I would say, in general about Bitcoin, the level of knowledge that people come to my workshops or talks is lower than I experienced it in Western countries. But the understanding of how it can help is much better in the global South. So if you have experienced hyperinflation, if you have experienced how banks do not work, if you live under circumstances where you cannot send money freely in and out of your country or even use it without being monitored by the leading political party or by their opponents, whatever, when money is used as a weapon against you, which is not yet here, then the understanding of a censorship-resistant hard asset is faster, and even if it's not in that words, because mostly it's not in that words, is much faster, and you are more welcome with that message than in the countries where I live, or in the Western countries. Yeah, and that's also, of course, a rewarding effect for me, although it's built on suffering, which is not so good.
Yeah, it's the unfortunate reality of Bitcoin. You're more likely to understand the need for something like Bitcoin if you experience that first and foremost. And for those of us in the West that are trying to promote education, or even myself, sometimes I do ask, okay, I haven't experienced that suffering. How did I got lucky enough, I guess, to see its potential, and drown out the noise from my left counterparts, to try to push through that and hopefully pull them along. But my focus right now is in amplifying these stories because I think they're most important. That's what Bitcoin is for. And if the others come along at some point and want to talk or learn more, that's great. But I'm focusing on those who need it most right now and trying to amplify those stories, or at least amplifying stories to those people who can support those projects. If you're in a point of privilege, donate money and funding to these groups. Go and listen to them, provide resources, all of that stuff, which we'll share.
Yeah, which is very important because, we know Bitcoin has no marketing department. So we have the resources have to come from our community. It's the way it is. Yeah. And even more if we want resources that are not sponsored by companies or things like that and promote a certain story. Yeah. I stopped taking sponsorships end of last year because I knew it before, but I thought I want to focus really on donations and community donations because I want to stay neutral. It's also like Andreas Antonopoulos is here, the guiding example. So I always will try to. I did it before with sponsorship as well. I always said the things I think help people the most and not me the most. Yeah, and I think that's important thing, and that's why this community support is so important. Yeah, because it's a decentralized money. Also, the efforts to bring education to the market will be decentralized in a way. Yeah? It will be me and other people who do similar things like me. There are great examples all over the world, and they are getting more and more. And this is that's great to see. Yeah, I now then more than ever, 2 years ago when I came the first time to Zimbabwe and Botswana. There were almost none of these initiatives. And now you have the Bitcoin cowries in Ghana, Bitcoin Ikasi, Bitcoin Witsend, Bitcoin, now I have lost the word, free Bitcoin communities in South Africa, in Namibia, in Nigeria, in Kenya. We have gridless mining, and things like that, where, there was Bitcoin mining in African countries before, but they were single entities, and now they are really growing, and only in 2 years. And just imagine what's happening the next 2 years. Yeah. So Bitcoin is unstoppable, not only as a tool, also in adoption.
And I know, because I think at some point, like right now, a lot of the folks listening to this probably know you are progressive and Bitcoiners. But what eventually I think will happen is, fortunately, unfortunately, once we get into more of a bull market, people will probably start looking back on episodes or kind of coming to different podcasts and education. And we're here for that. And if you're listening and it's 6 months, a year from now, hopefully you find this valuable as well. But in terms of mining, I want to touch on that because that's so important and one of those things that definitely flips it on its head. And we'll have other speakers on to focus, and we have in the past as well, on another huge area of focus for us, which is the environment, climate change, and Bitcoin mining, because that takes a little bit more to dig into for people to understand using energy is actually a good thing in certain contexts, things like that. But for you, what are some of those things you've seen in terms of Bitcoin mining, and what are I'll just ask it more broadly, and you can take it where you want. What are some of the benefits of Bitcoin mining in these environments?
Yeah, the first thing is you have an abundance of sun, of course, and you have hydropower in many of these countries that's not used because they don't have the infrastructure to bring it to the centers, the urban centers where it's needed, and things like that. And just as an example, so one of my pet projects was bringing Bitcoin mining to Zimbabwe, and we did it. I can say we have a guy who's living in the UK, so he's a Zimbabwean, but he also left the country and living in the diaspora, like millions of Zimbabweans. And he has a farm in Zimbabwe. And he told me, look, I have this solar power panels and the whole setup, and I only need the power during some months for my farm. The other time I have excess energy, and I would really try to start Bitcoin mining. And then I connected him with a guy who was already following me. And that guy then donated 5 or 6 ASICs machines, mining machines, to him because he didn't use it anymore. He wanted to buy the next generation and gave those away. So the guy sets up that mining with 6 ASICs with his solar power and tells me I'm making about $25 a day. And I mean, if you know that many people in Zimbabwe in a month maybe earn $50 or doctors in hospitals earn $300 a month, or teachers, then you know that $25 a day is very much. And so the project was a success. And a few months in, he calls me again and says, I have lost the equipment. And I said, what does that mean? You have lost the equipment? How can you lose the equipment? And my friend from Zimbabwe explained to me that people in Zimbabwe don't say they were stolen. Someone basically stole his whole solar power infrastructure. And, the inverters and the batteries, they are very expensive. And if he now has to buy these new solar power infrastructure, then he of course, Bitcoin mining can bring some of that back. But if you had to pay for all this setup upfront, then it's not so easy for a small miner to get into the positive profit side. But on the other hand, you still have KYC-free Bitcoin. There are no exchanges in Zimbabwe. You need to know people. You need to trust people who exchange it for you. And so if anyone in Zimbabwe has excess energy and the infrastructure to run miners, and you need a lot of electricity, I also know someone who tried to do the same, and he was thinking like, oh, I can do that with my regular PV. He had quite a surprise and realized he can't run these miners. So. And it's basically building infrastructure and to be more to build an even more uncensorable environment, a structure, also you can build a circular economy around that, for instance. My dream was actually also to bring a Blockstream satellite receiver to the same place where the miner was. So the miner could send and receive the Bitcoin blocks from the blockchain and be independent of the internet providers in Zimbabwe, because sometimes they turn off the internet. That happens actually on a regular basis. I think in 2 weeks is the next election, and people already think, the internet will not work on that day. That was the idea, to make this whole self-sovereign setup really self-sovereign. But because people are so poor, they basically steal everything, and that's how the infrastructure was lost. I just wanted to add another example of something that people in our lives, in our world, can't understand because they don't see it. We also had a program where we donated Bitcoin to a school, and they could buy new computers. And of course, we did that through Bitcoin. And the school headmaster, was then arrested by the police because they were questioning about the funds, where they come from and how they got to that money. And it's really a very sensitive space, and it's very risky. And that's also a reason why you often won't hear a lot about Bitcoin usage in countries like that, because people are afraid. And of course, I would also not tell anyone that I'm using Bitcoin publicly in these countries. So that's on another level. I mean, we can talk about it, we can use it. And I don't think that Western or Northern or, let's say, democratic countries forbid or ban Bitcoin. I mean, if it happens, then you know where we are, at which point.
Yeah, and I do, I want to tread lightly on this, but there are folks that will say, well, every country is authoritative. The US is an authoritarian place and this and that. And
Yeah.
my argument, because I'm in this space doing this podcast, doing education, wanting to roll out more media around this, to apply it to the real world and folks in the real world. Because I think a lot of Bitcoiners are actually getting into and understanding Bitcoin education, but I want just everyday people to start accessing Bitcoin
Mhm.
education. And if you lead by saying the US is an authoritarian state, we're not having the same conversation right now as to what you're referring to. And there is a big major difference. So I won't argue with people on that point, but I would say, like, no, we're actually talking about there are democratic freedoms in the US, in the West, that here just do not exist even outright. So there is more of a need and understanding for Bitcoin in that regard. Sure, if it gets there to one point, that's a different conversation. But right now, I kind of push back on those statements and say, let's look at the world as it is today. And those are the conversations I'm interested in having. But I wanted to bring up that point because that's another point. I think you had said it maybe in an interview or writing previously that Bitcoin can topple dictatorships and authoritarian. And that's one of those statements that can be said and mean a million different things. And I think from my perspective, it's understanding that if you're separating folks from using Bitcoin rather than using the oppressive state money that funds and fuels these regimes, that's, I think, the path that we're talking about. But can you elaborate more on that, of how, if Bitcoin use is widely adopted or used by folks in Zimbabwe or other places, what can that look like to topple an authoritarian regime by just opting out and using Bitcoin?
Yes, I mean, to set the record straight, I didn't say that initially. I heard that in a podcast interview from my friend Meron Estefanos, who is
Mhm.
a human rights activist, and I had her on my show. And she's working a lot with Eritrean refugees. She saved refugees who were kidnapped and held against ransom, and they used Bitcoin to free those refugees.
Mm.
And she was the one who said to me initially that Bitcoin can topple dictators. And
Mhm.
I mean, she lives in countries like that, or has experience with it, because she said, when you basically take away the money that is feeding these dictatorships, then you can dry them out. They don't have the
Yeah.
funds anymore. If you don't need their Zimbabwe dollar shitcoins or any other national currency they can print however they want to, if you don't use it anymore, and if they can't censor you, they can't, if you use Bitcoin peer-to-peer without KYC identification, you have a very high level of privacy. Even, compared to credit cards or banks or whatever, I mean, people don't use
Mhm.
that most of the cases anyhow, but um, and Bitcoin is the only tool that no one can take away from you. But even if they put you in jail and threaten you, you don't need to tell them their seed. I mean, you have forgotten your seed, it's somewhere,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
that's the power that Bitcoin gives you. And no other tool gives that to you. And that's the reason why dictatorships could be toppled if all people were to use Bitcoin and not tell their leaders in a way, in an
Mhm.
anonymous, trusted way. I mean, there are a lot of communities and people like in Zimbabwe, everyone knows how dangerous it is to do some things. Yeah. For instance, exchanging Zimbabwe dollar to US dollar on the street is not allowed too. So you
Mhm.
basically meet with your dealer in a side road and exchange money. But the dealer trusts you and you trust the dealer because it's a deal you make in a way,
Mhm.
to extend your freedom. And it's a help for everyone. Everyone has, out of these two parties, has an advantage of it. So you won't go to the police and say, that guy is a money dealer. Why would you do that? And I think it could also work with Bitcoin that way. When people see how positive and empowering it is for them and how they could use it against their dictators, that's a tool.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's how I see that.
And when you're doing these education workshops and these other resources, what are some of the Bitcoin tools? I mean, it doesn't have to be specific companies, but that, sure, if there's specific wallets and things, but The ways in which you approach that for people that don't know and haven't looked into your resources, can you kind of walk us through what those workshops look like, just to show people from step one, like using Bitcoin? What is your approach to that for people to understand how to hold it, how to use it, things like that?
Yeah, it very much, of course, depends on the setting. So, what's the audience? What are their goals? Where do they live in a way? What are the problems? I always try to, like when I go into a country where I've never been, or I always try to look what's the current situation there? What's their situation with inflation? What's there with the banking system? Which do they already have Bitcoin exchanges or not? So to prepare for the different needs, yeah. And so it can be if it's a workshop or a seminar that lasts a few hours, then I'm basically starting a little bit with what is money, what is inflation? Where does money come from? And then the main part always is like the differences between Bitcoin and national currency or fiat money, as we call it. And I always try to connect it to use cases for the people. So the understanding from that side comes relatively fast, because if you tell a Zimbabwean, no government can change your Bitcoin or can take it away from you, then everybody understands immediately what that means. Mm-hmm. And so my goal is to bring them to self-custody as fast as possible. So I'm not going there and saying download wallet of Satoshi and then I send you 100 Satoshis and goodbye. Now I orange pilled you. Mm-hmm. I really put an emphasis on long-term sustainable education. That's why I try to support these local Bitcoin groups also with education, to have people on the ground where people then can go and ask again, because Bitcoin is such a fast developing technology and space that you have new wallets every other month. And some of them then make things more convenient, like the new Phoenix wallet, for instance. It's a Lightning wallet, a self-custody Lightning wallet, where you basically a little bit run your own Lightning node on your phone, and it's getting more convenient now. You don't need to understand channels anymore, Lightning channels. What is this? So I really try to onboard people into self-custody because I also believe that if people start with wallet of Satoshi and it works, why should they ever change to another wallet? Right. For them, it doesn't make sense, yeah? And most people don't have the time nor the interest to research the newest Bitcoin tools out there and try them. They just want to have things that work. And I want to give them the tools that are the most secure for them to not lose their money and their keys, and give them a knowledge of what is privacy and how can you support the level of privacy you have with the use of Bitcoin, and how do you need to use Bitcoin and Lightning to stay as private as possible. Because I really fear that some of these countries will go down hard on people who use Bitcoin. And that's why I also always say, stay anonymous as much as possible. No one needs to know that you hold or use Bitcoin. Just do it.
Yeah. Just use it. Yeah. That's one of my favorite things right now, probably in the space in terms of products, is these Lightning wallets that are coming out that, I mean, gosh, even a couple of years ago, it was only custodial, or you had to run your own node, which even for me, I got an Umbrel node set up and things like that. But just the maintenance, the management of this. Also, in terms of traceability and trackability, it's actually, you really have to know what you're doing, or even that your node can be traced, right, to a physical location in these areas, which could be, it's less dangerous for me here in the US than it is for someone who can have their actual node or their, physically traceable as well. So having it, they're even developing somewhere channels you can, open and close a channel on your mobile phone without even knowing it, just in one transaction. And then you do it again, and it's a separate node that's spun up, like kind of on the back end. It's absolutely amazing. So it's convenient, but it's self-sovereign as well. And for a long time in Bitcoin, there were two opposing camps. And there's still many in Bitcoin that are solely focused on ease of use and centralized authorities. And we know a lot of those players in the US who are doing that. But these really creative devs who are doing, okay, open source, self-sovereign, and it's so easy and fun to use. Like that is cutting edge right now, which is absolutely amazing.
Absolutely. And what for me is also cutting edge and is a big opportunity is earning Bitcoin through value for value, for instance. Or if you start like a membership program, which I'm doing right now, I'm accepting Bitcoin via a BTC Pay server. And at the same time, I know they are working at the moment on a module or a plugin that can do subscription-based memberships with Bitcoin. I will be integrating that too. And that's also a tool. I mean, just imagine there are millions or billions of young people in Africa. The average age in Africa is 20 years. The average age in Austria is, I think, or in Europe is 47 or something like that. So now just imagine where will be more adoption of a new technology that's understood and used by young people, millions of young people who want to work, who need tools and chances like to earn some money from abroad. And so I believe there will be an explosion of innovation. There's also a program called Kala, where Abu Bakr Nur Khalil is one of the founders, and they are doing education for Bitcoin developers in African countries. They have a scholarship program. And I think that's also very, very important because only people on the ground who know the problems can develop tools that work in that environment and are uncensorable in the long run and things like that, because they have much harder circumstances and they need to develop around that to still stay uncensorable. And that's why I believe that in the coming years, I guess the most innovative stuff will come from these countries. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, and the young people in these countries, right? I mean, just an incredible doc that came out recently too from Max DeMarco featuring Mi Premier Bitcoin in El Salvador. So just education for young people, and it almost brings you to tears in terms of like understanding young people now they have a future in a different way in terms of like actually having money that they themselves can own and they can build a business for themselves, because it's very broad similarity. I come from the nonprofit world, and a lot of the inner city young people we work with, when you ask them what they want to do, a lot of them want to be entrepreneurial because that's typically what their immigrant parents are doing. They're running convenience stores, they're running hair salons. And it's similar in these markets that you're talking to. I'm sure a lot of the young people are there like, oh, now they're seeing like content creators just by accessing the internet, right? And so they can actually use that through some of the tools you're mentioning to accept Bitcoin, right? Or they can run up and spin up different fediments and help people source that, or educate people locally and be paid in Bitcoin. So it's a creator economy that's more and more easily accessible to anyone globally, especially young people, through Bitcoin now. They don't have to worry about all these currency things that you're discussing. Their future might be a distant memory. But they're like, oh yeah, my parents have to deal with this or go to this market, or in the US deal with Western Union and all these other factors. And that's incredibly hopeful. So, a lot of these episodes when I'm talking to people, we focus on a lot of the situations currently, but Bitcoin actually brings hope in a new way where you don't have to rely on the government getting better anytime soon. Those are issues that will continue to persist. Like Bitcoin doesn't necessarily solve that, but it brings about a new ecosystem and a way to potentially topple these regimes and things like this. It's really exciting. Yeah.
And you have an alternative the first time in thousands of years to the nation state money. And just because I said Kala, this educational program, when I was on the ground and did my education in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Ghana, South Africa, I realized that it's great that I'm going there to build trust, because there are a lot of scams going on. And if you're there, if you're coming and you spend your time and your money on trying to share education and true knowledge, then people are very appreciative of that. But I realized it's good to build that trust and give this initial idea of there is something like Bitcoin, but then you need something sustainable. You need to guide is such a way from above. I don't mean it like that, but you need to offer a space where they can educate themselves over the long term. Because as we said before, the space and the technology is changing so fast that you not only need people on the ground who build these communities and want to start their own educational initiatives. And that's why I started a program now, which is called Crack the Orange, where these aspiring Bitcoin educators and community builders can apply for a scholarship. And they can then come into my class, do the Learn Bitcoin course to get the knowledge to educate their peers. And they can stay in that program for a year, maybe even longer, we'll see. But at the moment, it's a year. And it's possible for companies in the space or for private people who want to donate to the work I do, to donate seats in that program to these aspiring educators. And that's a way how I want to train the trainers to build a sustainable movement of educators and creators and things like that and people like that. And because then I think it's up to the people on the ground. They will know what to do. But initially I want to support with Crack the Orange this building of knowledge in these countries. And at the same time, because I just said membership and subscriptions with Bitcoin, some people ask me, so you don't take sponsorships, how can I support your work? And up until now, it was donations. But now you can basically also buy a membership in your national currency or in Bitcoin. And I'm doing monthly live Q&As where people can ask questions. I'm starting my podcast again.
Great.
And then people can ask questions to the guest I have. And I want to build a community of learners where also these educators, like from Ghana and from Nigeria and from Kenya and from Zimbabwe, they have a space where they can connect with each other, basically in my Bitcoin for Fairness Crack the Orange program, where they can learn from each other and exchange ideas and things like that. And that was also my how shall I say, the reason why I did that program, because I thought only going there is not enough. Yeah, you can't just leave them hang there. Yeah.
Well, that's a real missionary approach. The initial part, not what you're doing now, is you go in, you give from their point of view. Maybe they don't initially. You give these poor people resources, food, whatever. You try to convert them, right? And again, people from religious backgrounds don't hear what I'm not saying. It's more like this approach of in and out, and then there's no follow up, there's no ongoing support, there's no resources. But yeah, from my nonprofit context, people really understand the whole train the trainer model, and that's what I think is super needed. And I'm seeing a lot more of that in this bear market, like these things kind of built out that are train the trainer models, because I get very hesitant and look through it from that hesitation of like a missionary model of, okay, what is this person who I know is from the US? They go to a nation that you're mentioning or someone from the West, but then you look at these models that are train the trainer, that are setting up sustainable resources, sustainable funding from those that might be able to donate. And what's great about these things is some people might say, okay, what you're donating to is a humanitarian crisis. You're donating to nonprofits. You're donating to educating. You're not donating to a speculative crypto project. Like you're donating to actually people building out their local economies. And that's what I'm trying to bring as well through this podcast, is for people to understand that's what we're here doing. It's not about let's just focus so much on Bitcoin that is the thing. No, we're focusing on local communities, and Bitcoin is the tool through that. And there's other tools as well. I think Nostr is an incredible tool that I think hopefully people like an open protocol, similar permissionless state to Bitcoin, that people can utilize to, like you said, content creation and fundraising and zapping on to accept Bitcoin through that. That's another great resource. And a year from now, we won't be able to keep up with what else comes out there on the shoulders of these types of things.
Yeah, I hope that the freedom comes back to the internet. That was initially the reason for many cypherpunks and internet pioneers to support that whole technology, right? I mean, it's a military technology, but in the end, from the communication aspect and from the aspect of how people now have a voice, it's a tool for the people. Of course, with all its disadvantages that we see through the centralization and through the capitalization, or do you say that, of the money, and VCs who put in millions into something like WorldCoin and then come with the, we want to help the people, when all they do is basically catalog people, and with all the dangers that come with that. And so I lost my line now. I don't know what I wanted to say, but you mentioned
WorldCoin, and it sends me spinning into like how sick and disgusting it is. Luckily, on that, I think New York Times actually wrote a piece that was at least skeptical, at least like what's going on here. So, irregardless, so one thing I want to mention, because we're talking about kind of the internet and freedom, and one thing that I try to focus on, I try to focus more of the time and resources on what we're talking about, but a little bit on this next topic because it still exists. So polarization around things like Bitcoin, and we're focused on Bitcoin. So in the United States especially, it happens in the West as well, but particularly in the US, and for folks that might be listening, there's such an extreme continuous polarization of Bitcoin. And I mean this almost in political parties. Like right now, there's a bit more support in terms of Bitcoin specifically from right-wing politicians in the US, and there's a lot of hesitation and sometimes outright hate and defiance from folks on the left that we're trying to speak to through this podcast. Literally, whether it's a politician that listens at one point or politicians we're speaking to and trying to engage with, that I'm doing behind the scenes with so many others, and Dennis Porter as well, trying to talk to politicians like, stop politicizing this. So when you're, I know you spend most of your time and effort, for good reason, and I understand why, in Africa focusing on these things because it's silliness at the end of the day. But right now, it is still affecting adoption in the US. It is affecting so many different things, this polarization of Bitcoin. So when you think about polarization, whether it's in Germany and Austria, in Europe, but especially in the US, how would you engage with folks around this topic? That, let's say in general, I know it doesn't generally shake out like this, but kind of in general, the left is a bit hesitant and sometimes fearful of Bitcoin, saying that it is killing the environment, it's for criminals, or that it's right-wing propaganda, whatever the case may be, or that it's speculative. And the right has some cheerleaders that I think are just using it for political gain, right? Trying to get votes. That's my personal opinion on that. How would you approach people that way? Or maybe there's folks listening that have only heard that about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, that's an ongoing story. I mean, also the reason why are there not more women in this space, I spoke to a young woman some years ago. She was a part of a team who did an interview with me, and after all I said with human rights and women can own money like Bitcoin in some nation states where they are not allowed to own property or inherit anything, she said to me, "Oh, it's the first time I think about it this way. I only hear it from my young male friends, and it disgusts me because they only talk about money and how they can make more money. And I don't see. I thought, exactly. I thought that's Bitcoin, and I said no. And that's the great problem, yes. And also that's the problem of the left or the left liberal, which I count myself in that." Sphere. Yeah, I mean, actually, I try to stay neutral about all of that. But I'm very sad to see that people don't get it and they just push it away and say, no, look at what Greenpeace USA is writing. Yeah. But interestingly enough, even my father, who I always thought is opposing that technology, said yesterday to me, I think that is shifting, because I mentioned the electricity use of Bitcoin and the story that the media makes out of it. And he said, I see more and more reports where the thing is shifting, and people will find out that actually that's not the problem. Yeah, and I really would hope that people, left-leaning people, at least read a book about it, and please not the Bitcoin Standard. Read
your book, Anita.
Jason Myers, or read mine, or books from Andreas Antonopoulos. Listen to these people, because we are here. Yeah, we are in the minority, but we are here. The loudest people are, yes, the conservative, right-leaning ones. But this is not Bitcoin. Bitcoin is for anyone. It's a technology, and the technology works regardless. I mean, but Bitcoin also works for dictators. Yes, but that's the nature of it. Yeah, it's like the internet. It also works for everyone, and it should. And I would wish, in a way, that more people, I think I try to do it the best way I can to stay very neutral. If you follow my Twitter profile and my tweets, or X's, or how they are called now, then you will see that I really try to stay out of this tribalism and this religious aspect of Bitcoin. And calling me Maxi or a pleb, no, thank you, because that immediately puts you in the same corner, like people who have like really right-wing things they believe, or they are very conservative and have problems with abortion right, or with rights of people like LGBT people and things like that. I'm always appalled, and I don't get it how Bitcoiners even can think that it's okay to have a gun, but it's not okay for a woman to have control over her own body. I don't know, but that's also a very US American thing. Sadly, this is spilling over to many African countries where you have worse laws against LGBTIQ groups than ever before, because it's not a thing that African countries actually had. I mean, I want to say, we're a totally accepted group, and that's a very Western thing, to hate on lesbians and gays and such. And they are oh my God, how is this called? Sündenböcke. Scapegoats, in many countries, and that's sad to see. And it's even more sad to see a few, I don't know, I wouldn't say many, but voices on Twitter in the Bitcoin space who really also pressure that idea, so that gays are pedophiles and things like that. And I want to distance myself from that, and that's why I'm so loud about, and why I now also in Prague on stage said, one reason for me why I'm a Bitcoiner is I'm a lesbian. And I don't need to say that. I don't want people to know what my sexuality or my preferences are. It's not interesting. But in that case, I want to be a signal for those who need to hear that there are people like me in the Bitcoin, and we are Bitcoiners. Because I think Bitcoin is exactly for those who are in the minority, who are being oppressed. It gives them a voice and freedom and power. And that's why I do it.
And I think it's super commendable, and not that anyone ever has to say these personal stories, but I think one of the unfortunate realities, and the only reason I talk about it, like I am very left, very progressive in the US, live in New England, which is a relatively progressive area in the US outside of Boston. And in my daily life, in my nonprofit work, diversity, equity, inclusion, working amongst the LGBTQ community, all of this has been an ever-present part of my life for over a decade. So coming into Bitcoin and seeing that was different made me more adamant about, all right, I want to present my voice here so that other people can see that, okay, Bitcoin is not just blank, whatever they think it is. Like Bitcoin is, and my intention has never been to make Bitcoin political, to make it about these issues, but Bitcoin already has been made political in the real world. So my goal is to come in to spread more diverse thought about that, so we can get back to, and in tandem, talk about the issues like we spent the majority of this podcast talking about, which are the important issues, while also mentioning, listen, so Ted Cruz is a very polarizing figure in the United States in terms of like himself as a politician. In my neck of the woods in New England, a conservative politician like that would be a turnoff for many people. Ted Cruz using Bitcoin should not limit or hinder your use or advocacy of Bitcoin. Those are two very different things. So I want people to understand that people who you don't like are going to use and advocate for Bitcoin. And by the way, many of them advocating for Bitcoin who are politicians might not actually be into Bitcoin. They might just be trying to get votes from the left or the right, whatever the case may be. But we talk about this to say Bitcoin is this neutral monetary technology. It's political in the sense that it's giving more power to the people. That's a political action, a very progressive and left action as well. But we talk about it because too many people think that Bitcoin in the U.S. is a right wing phenomenon. And so I'm here and talk with guests when it makes sense to say it is not, and it drives me. Yeah,
it's the same in Austria and Germany, but I have to say it's also interesting to see that, for instance, in Germany, only the AfD, which is a very right-wing, very right-wing party in Germany, is speaking openly in supporting Bitcoin, about supporting Bitcoin, and that's also, I mean,
I don't think I knew that. Wow.
Of course, the public or the media then believes it's a right-wing tool,
Yeah.
Which is not, we know that, but it will take time, I guess. I mean, for me, and it sounds like you are the same, I don't need politicians in Bitcoin. I don't need that. Yeah. I just want people to use it.
It's not what we're here for. It's money for the people. Yeah. Oh, anyway, that was a good, because I'll say, and that's the reason I opened this conversation with, like, I know you've had to see a lot, A, throughout your life, but B, in the Bitcoin space. And yet you are so laser focused on, like, this is why I'm here. This is what I'm doing. Speaking up when it makes sense, and when it's the right moment to be to be a voice for that group. But one other thing I will say, because I've been trying to do more research about it, and I think it will happen in terms of censorship and things like that. Also, in the United States, one of the things that got a worldwide phenomena really was the trucker protest in Canada, right? When they were closing bank accounts and tracking Bitcoin addresses and all of these different things as well, and doing very totalitarian action against this group. A lot of my progressive group and friends would have seen that as like, okay, that was a crazy right wing movement. That's the way it was talked about, without understanding the implications of, like, oh, that was kind of wrong. And the way I try to frame it is, imagine if you are running an abortion clinic. Imagine if you're running a local Black Lives Matter chapter in Boston or in Austin, Texas, or Miami, Florida, wherever. And they do the same thing, right? Whatever is done to that group you disagree with, that means they can also do it to your group. So I'm also trying to have conversations like that on this podcast with progressive friends, whoever, to say these things are wrong and here's why, because they can also do that to you. Because right now in the US, we have, for whatever people think, like more kind of a left Democrat in terms of parties. And we're not a Democrat podcast. We talk to anybody. Like, we're talking about progressive values. It's outside of politics or political parties. But it's been typically Democrats, quote unquote, in charge in the US in terms of policies. But let's say that flips again. A lot of these places that have been homes and safe havens federally for LGBTQ populations, trans rights, for abortion clinics, those can really, really be called into question under a different administration. And so I've been trying to talk with some of these groups, especially gay activists, and I haven't seen much out there in terms of Bitcoin and gay activism as a tool for maybe at some point, because that tide has been it's been very uncertain in the United States, with certain groups that are very, very opposed to these types of activists having their voice or accessing healthcare or all of these other things that are deeply important to me and friends I know and things like that. I've been trying to talk to them about Bitcoin, and it hasn't been clicking. And some of them are allowing right-wing politics to get in the way of understanding how Bitcoin can be a tool for them. So that's also been deeply concerning to me. And they're spinning up different crypto projects, actually, to support things, or like different shit coins, to say this is the, like, LGBTQ shitcoin. That if you research and Google it, you'll see what I'm talking about. I don't want to platform those things here in terms of these speculative coins that don't have decentralized authority. But I want groups like that to get Bitcoin, and I hope it will happen at some point. And I'll do what I can to try to continue pressing on that. But it's still needed here in some of those contexts for freedom.
You're everywhere. I mean, and you mentioned the trucker protests. I mean, it's the same for me, and that's why I mentioned the history and my grandparents at the beginning, because that's what I've learned, that powers can change very, very suddenly, and technology or tools that you first found completely okay because they are against your opponents, and yes, that's not okay what they do. So yes, we do that. We use that tool against them. The next day it can be used against yourself. And I think that's what many people, I don't know why they don't see it, but it has happened. And as we know, history rhymes and it repeats itself in a way.
Yeah. It's very unfortunate. We'll keep beating that drum, as I know you will on your end. In wrapping up here, I want to make sure that people know where to access resources, know where to. You've mentioned a lot of different things. We'll be sure to put it in the show notes, but sometimes people don't read those. So, to direct people where to go and to where to find you and the different groups you're working with, what's the best place for people to go?
So the best place is basically my newsletter. It's a free newsletter once a week, and it's at anita.link/news. You can subscribe to them. And then my new program is called Crack the Orange, and it's cracktheorange.com. As I said before, builders and aspiring educators who can't afford can apply for a scholarship. And then basically it's my website, anitaposch.com, and my Twitter handle is also my name, Anita Posch, with a C in between the S and the H.
Excellent. Well, Anita, I want to thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for being a voice. You were one of the early voices for me to be interested in Bitcoin and to see, this is something I, with my values, can get into. Mm-hmm. And I think you've done that for hundreds of thousands of people. Wow. So I want to thank you for that. I truly think, because I think there are a lot of people that peripherally see your resources and see your name globally, right? There's a lot of folks in the US, a lot of folks in Europe. And I think it's paying dividends and doing incredible work. And so thank you for all you do. And if there's anything we can do, from my end, the Progressive Bitcoiner, you know how to reach us. And just very honored for you to jump on this podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Trey, and all the best also to you. And I hope maybe we'll meet in person one day.
Yes, I would love that. And I would love to, whether it be Zimbabwe, Austria, the US,
well, actually,
I'm hoping to get all out.
You said you are in New England, because I'm coming to the US in September. So, but won't be in New England.
Well, I'm hoping to bring a bit more of Bitcoin specifically to Boston area. Boston is a very highly educated place, very blockchain, crypto. Austin and Nashville get all the love, but New York, I know PubKey, and there's been many other places.
Austin and Nashville are exactly the cities where I'm going.
Oh, exactly. Which makes it. There's a lot of Bitcoin creators out there and awesome stuff happening. I want to see more of that up here. So, but yes, I would love to cross paths at some point. And thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you.